And hello Stowe community, welcome to part 6 of our Back to Basics tutorial series. In this tutorial I'm going to talk mainly about triggers and the different ways that you can use triggers to make your Foundry mission better. The first question you may have is, what are triggers? Well, at the very basic level, triggers are the ability to make something appear or disappear. That's all you're doing in the end. But there are complex things that you can do with that ability to make things appear and disappear. So let's go to our Vulcan ground map, and I should show you the story tab real quick because I took out the objectives on the second map, so there's nothing in the storyboard for us to work with. But let's go to the map tab, and you'll see the only thing on Vulcan is our diplomat and a spawn point, and I moved the spawn point down here. So let's say that we wanted to make something appear or disappear. For example, say the task is to talk to a contact, and she gives you a clue, and that's followed by an explosion, because explosions are always fun. So let's search for an explosion, and we'll put it on the map, put it where we want the explosion to be, and if you click on the States tab, that's where the triggers are. And right now it's set to be immediately hidden, initial state of hidden, but then it immediately turns to visible, and it never goes invisible. That's how this ladder works. It's how do you want something to go from hidden to visible, and how do you want something to go from visible to hidden. So let's say that we have an object on the map like the explosion. We want to trigger it somehow. If you click on it from going hidden to visible, you'll have a number of options. The first is component complete, followed by component reached, dialog prompt reached, objective in progress, and objective complete. The two that you probably immediately understand are objective in progress and objective complete. And that means in the storyboard, if you have something set to appear while an objective is in progress, then as soon as the player moves from one objective to the next objective, if the trigger is set up to become visible during that objective, that's when it becomes visible. And it's the same thing with objective complete. And you might think to yourself, well, aren't those kind of the same things depending on what you pick? You'll find as you work with triggers that you do need both. The one option that you might immediately be confused by is this component complete. And you might say, well, what's a component? A component in the Foundry can be objects. They can be any of the details that you put on the map. They can also be an enemy group that you put on the map. And that's basically it. A component is something that gets completed, and by completed it means it becomes interacted with, or it becomes killed. And so let's say that I just want to put a different object in the map. Let's put a wall. And I'll put a cave rock. No, that's too big. I'll just put a console. And let's say you want the explosion to appear after the player interacts with the console as a component. So I'll change the state of the explosion to become visible when a component is complete, and I can select the console wall component that I just put in the map. Now, when the player goes on the map, the console will be flashing, even though it's not an object to interact with in the story tab. Right? Because if it was an object to interact with in the story tab, it would flash because that's the objective, is to interact with the object. But here we've just put an object on a map with a different trigger set to become visible when the other component is complete. So then the console has a flashing icon, or it flashes so the player knows to interact with it. Okay. So that's how component completes work. You'll find that you'll use that quite often. The other one here is component reached, and that refers to a reach marker. So you can have the explosion happen once the player gets down the steps at a certain point. And they trigger that reach marker. And right now I'll click it and it says there are no available components on the map because I haven't put a reach marker on the map. The next one in line is dialog prompt reached. You may think, well, we've already put dialogues in the map. Actually, I removed them, but let's say that we want to put a dialogue in a map, so we'll put a dialogue with contact in the storyboard, and we'll fill out, she says hi, then go to the map tab, and let's say we want to make the explosion happen when a dialogue prompt is reached. There are no available dialogues to choose from. And it's the same thing if you put a pop-up dialog in the Story tab too. It will say there are no dialogues to choose from. And that's because this trigger only works with a specific kind of dialogue, and that's this pop-up dialog blue bubble that you add to the map. And so you could have a storyboard filled with dialogues that consists of talk to contacts or pop-up dialogues, but you won't be able to use triggers in conjunction with them because it only recognizes these guys. So keep that in mind. We'll deal more with these guys in the next tutorial. Okay, so that is an overview of the basics. There is one other type of trigger that I want to show you. And I don't know why I don't have it. Oh, yeah, I know why. Let's set the console with a trigger to become invisible. And then you have this other option of this component complete. And now you notice there's a new tab over here on the side called triggers, and that gives you the ability to do an interact text. So scan the console. And you can even give the player an animation while they're doing it. With that setup, then the console will be on a map and it'll be flashing, and the player can go to interact with it, and then it disappears after they interact. This is really useful. You might have trouble understanding why you'll need to use that right now, but I think once you really get going, you'll be using that option more and more. Another option that you'll be using is the ability to put invisible objects on a map. Because notice that the map here, Vulcan, it has a lot of stuff on it. It's got the fountain, it's got mountains and benches and all kinds of stuff that you might want to use as components. But you can't, because you can't select stuff that's built into the map as a component to complete. So what you'll probably end up doing is you put an invisible object. Say the task is to scan the fountain, well, you'll put an invisible object at the spot where you want the player to scan, and that will be the component, and you'll just disguise the interact text as scan the fountain, or something along those lines. I think the more and more you play with triggers, the more you're going to be using these invisible objects, especially on the ground. In space, they can be a bit frustrating because they have, even though they're invisible, the text in this box will show up in space, so there'll be something there even though it's an invisible object. But for ground maps, they're really, really useful. Okay, that's really a basic overview of what triggers are. I do want to take a moment to talk about the limitations of triggers. So let's say that we have our Vulcan diplomat and we want at some point to make her go invisible. So she starts out visible, and we have all the trigger options here to make her go invisible. But let's say that in the storyboard, we have a task to talk to her. Talk to the Vulcan diplomat. Now if we go back to the map tab and we click on her triggers, all of a sudden we have one option to make her visible, and two options to make her invisible. Really two for both. And keep that in mind, because if an object is on your map and it's in the storyboard, a lot of times you lose the ability to do really creative and complex things with triggers. Whereas if it's not in the storyboard, if it's just a console there that's flashing and the player immediately goes up to it and sees it flashing, then there's all kinds of other things you can do with triggers that you can't do if the object or the person or the enemy is in your storyboard. So that's something to keep in mind. Many of the triggers have built-in limitations, and the different types of objects, say a reach marker, for example. Go to the Special tab. I'll put in a place marker. Well, a place marker doesn't have triggers at all, whereas the pop-up dialogues do. They have triggers. Also within the storyboard, certain things in the storyboard have triggers too, like buttons can have triggers. So click on a button, and the button can go from hidden to visible and vice versa. That can sometimes not work very well. Last time I really messed around with it, but you might play around with it because you could do some really neat things in dialogues with buttons set to appear and disappear. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. Stay tuned for next time for part 7, and we'll get into more complex things you can do with triggers. Oh, and last thing I want to say is that if you really want to get into triggers, there is a 8-part tutorial series at Starbase UGC. And those are still really useful. You can go through step by step on the 8-part series and learn almost every trick that you can do with triggers. Okay, stay tuned for next time. Enjoy the rest of the show.